If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's Golden Age, with a special emphasis on their lives behind the scenes. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Today, we will be talking about the great George Burns. There are going to be a lot of quotes in this episode. I mean, it's George Burns. Mr. Burns authored 9 books, and I read 2 of them during my journey of writing this episode. All My Best Friends and Gracie, a Love Story. I highly recommend both. So the information I'm sharing with you today comes right from the source, Mr. George Burns. I have vivid memories of George Burns from my own childhood in the 1980s. Well, vivid memories of his presence on TV, but I don't really remember in what capacity. He just seemed to be everywhere. Those round glasses, the constant cigar, that trademark wit. Now, after taking the journey through his life and spirit, I wish I would have paid closer attention while I had the chance. George Burns was born as Nathan Birnbaum on January 20th, 1896, on the Lower East Side of New York City. His parents were Louis or Lipa and Dora Birnbaum, both Jewish Romanian immigrants. George, I'm going to refer to him as George throughout his story, was the 9th child for Lipa and Dora, and they weren't done yet. After George, they still had 3 more children, rounding things off with an easy dozen. 5 boys and 7 girls. There were 7 sisters and 5 brothers, George later said. I think we ate one of my sisters. The family was not wealthy, far from. They weren't even financially stable. Like many other immigrants in turn-of-the-century New York City, the family struggled. They were poor. Imagine having 12 little mouths to feed and 24 little feet to keep shoed, and having virtually no money. Jobs were hard to come by for Lipa, but he took whatever he could. He often worked as a tailor, sweatshop-style employment, making $500 per year for his 60 hours per week of hard work. That would adjust to about $19,000 per year today, or about $6 per hour, if I did my math right. So, that being said, the Birnbaums were living a life of extreme poverty. We were so poor, I couldn't even afford to have my own dreams, George recalled. The family's home was a dark 3rd-floor tenement with no electricity and no water. Finding clean water was very difficult in that time. The streets were filled with horse droppings and sometimes even deceased horses. It was a very unsanitary environment. And with the population growing by the day, it was going to get much worse before it got any better. For the Birnbaum family in particular, it got as bad as it could possibly get in 1903 when George was 7 years old. A horrible case of influenza spread through the city. not helped at all by the extremely unsanitary conditions and lack of proper nutrition and drinking water. George's father, Lipa, became very sick, and his immune system just wasn't strong enough to fight it off. He succumbed to the influenza. George's mother, Dora, was left grieving for her husband while having to figure out how she was going to keep her family alive. 12 children, 4 of them being under the age of 7. I'm not exactly sure how old the oldest Birnbaum child was, but the oldest few were definitely old enough to help provide for the struggling family. I'm just not positive how many of them had made it to adulthood yet. Although adulthood often came quite early for those poor immigrant children. I do know that the older siblings helped with the family's survival after the loss of their father. And at 7 years old, George was considered one of the older siblings. He dropped out of school after his father died and went to work. At 7 years old, his formal education was done. He never returned. So, where does a 7-year-old go to find work? Well, sadly, in 1903 New York City, a 7-year-old immigrant boy could find employment much easier than we might imagine, because children were cheap labor. George was, of course, a paper boy, he was a shoe shine, and he was a syrup boy at a candy store. Well, this actually turned out to be a significant job for young George, because it was at the candy store where he met 3 other neighborhood boys. The boys all loved to sing and dance while working, and upon seeing this every day on his mail route, the local mail carrier suggested they form a quartet. So they did, with his help, and they began performing regularly for tips on the streets of the Lower East Side. They called themselves the Pee Wee Quartet. Once they mastered their routine, they performed at the Cannon Street Theater on amateur night. They played on ferry boats, too, and a couple more places that were extremely inappropriate for 4 7-year-old boys. Saloons and brothels. But hey, they'd perform wherever there were people willing to toss coins in their hats. The Pee Wee Quartet performed together for 3 years. Hot off the heels of the Pee Wee Quartet, 10-year-old George teamed up with another local boy named A.B. Kaplan, who was a great dancer, and they formed a duo. A.B. taught George better dancing skills, and the duo was even more successful than the Pee Wee Quartet. They called themselves the Burns Brothers, and it was at this point that Nathan Birnbaum began going by George Burns. The boys performed mostly in Nickelodeon's between silent film shorts. This was early on in the film days. It was 1906. A couple more years down the road, George joined the vaudeville circuit. It was in vaudeville where George met his first wife in 1917, Hannah Siegel, one of his dance partners. I'm uncertain of her age at the time, but George was 21. They did not marry for love, not at all. They wanted to tour together, and her parents wouldn't allow that unless they were married. So they got married, pretty much so they could go on the road together, and then they separated 6 months later at the end of the tour. The whole marriage was a formality, not a marriage based on love. In George's book, All My Best Friends, he talks a lot about what it was like to be a vaudeville performer. So many greats began in vaudeville. I like the way he described the lifestyle, so I'm going to share what he said with you. Quote, "There was never anything like vaudeville. Except for the big stars, being in vaudeville meant doing 3 shows a day and 5 shows on Saturdays and Sunday, often to half-filled houses. It meant carrying your whole life around in a steamer trunk, spending most of your time on trains or in hotel rooms so small that your shadow had to wait for you outside, cooking over illegal hot plates that had to be snuck into the hotel, or eating in one-arm joints or all-night hash houses. It meant never being able to save any money, and always being worried about being canceled or getting the next booking. And it meant never, ever being home for the holidays, and rarely seeing your family unless they were part of the act, but only if you were very lucky. I think that to most of us, probably the only thing that was worse than working in vaudeville was not working in vaudeville. I think I loved vaudeville more than any other part of my career. Vaudeville meant show business, and I wanted to be in show business. Vaudeville was that place where people who said they would do anything to be in show business did, end quote. He went on to say, quote, "When I started out, there were more than 5,000 vaudeville theaters in the country. Every city had several theaters, and most small towns had at least one. And if they didn't have a real theater, they had a lodge hall, a storefront, a high school auditorium, or an outdoor stage. There were so many theaters on the vaudeville circuit that if a performer had 14 good minutes, he could work for 6 years without changing a word or playing the same theater twice. I worked in places so small that before the show, I had to help the theater managers set up folding chairs for the audience. And the audiences in those small towns were tough, too. They even booed the way I set up chairs," end quote. So, as you can see, the life of a vaudeville performer was often far from glamorous. If you stuck with it for any length of time, it meant you had a real drive and passion for performing. And George Burns definitely had both of these things. During his time in vaudeville, George really honed in on comedy. He knew it was comedy that would be his ticket for survival. Not just the money he could hopefully earn as a vaudevillian comedian, but as a tool for surviving the harsh realities of life. The poverty, the daily struggle. George used his comedy as a shield. All of the pain he felt was magically transformed and released as comedy. He used it as a way to cope with his real-world realities. It would help him get through the worst of life. And it also led him to the woman who would complete him. The woman he didn't know he needed, but quickly realized he would never be able to live without her. His soulmate, Gracie Allen. George Burns met Gracie Allen in 1922. Gracie was a bit younger than George. She came from a show business family. Her parents were performers in San Francisco. They were Irish clog dancers, although her father walked away from his wife and 5 children when Gracie was only 5 years old. Still, performance was in her blood. She left school at 14 years old to chase a life in show business for herself. And it eventually led her right to George Burns. I want to read to you what George wrote about the moment he met Gracie. He said, quote, "Gracie was so pretty. She had long black hair with curls that spun down over her shoulders. Her skin was that Irish peach bloom, and she was wearing just a touch of makeup. She wasn't wearing lipstick. It was well known that the only people who wore lipstick were prostitutes and actors. Gracie was so small and delicate, I was almost afraid to shake her hand. The moment I heard her voice, I figured she had to be a dancer. She sounded like the bird who had been thrown out of the nest for singing off key. In fact, it turned out to be the perfect voice. Like Gracie herself, her voice was unforgettable." End quote. It may sound like it was love at first sight for George, but it wasn't. He admired Gracie, he respected her, and the two had great natural chemistry. But it took a little while for George to realize he was falling in love with Gracie. He put it like this, quote, "There wasn't one moment when I looked at Gracie and suddenly realized I was in love. It just happened. Love is a lot like a backache. It doesn't show up on x-rays, but you know it's there. And falling in love doesn't leave bruises unless the person you've fallen in love with isn't in love with you. Gracie wasn't in love with me. She was in love with Benny Ryan." End quote. Yes, Gracie Allen had a boyfriend. George and Gracie became comedy partners on the vaudeville circuit. George had cycled through many dance and comedy partners by the time he met Gracie, some male, some female. But he had never clicked with any of them the way he clicked with her. Not even close. They fit together perfectly. It was somewhere along the way of them curating their act and showcasing their amazing chemistry and comedic timing in front of audiences where the shift began. That shift from showbiz partners to something more. For George, at least. Let me help paint a picture of the stage magic of Burns and Allen. Gracie Allen didn't tell jokes. She was the joke. Sometimes just her mere presence sent the audience into laughter. She just exuded funny. In their routines, Gracie played the ditzy kind of woman who became the hilarious center of their comedic situations. Author Gerald Nachman puts it nicely. Quote, Gracie was different from the usual female flake. For one thing, she came across not as a flighty dope of blonde nitwit, but as a lovable eccentric. Burns preferred to call her off-center. Gracie always arrived at the truth, but in a wacky roundabout way, and in the end, she was usually proved correct. End quote. I would add to that, Gracie's stage persona comprehended every single thing very literally, which always made for some mixed wires and a funny interaction. George Burns referred to it as illogical logic. George and Gracie were the perfect pairing on the stage. To help give you a better idea, in George Burns' book, Gracie, A Love Story, he shared some of his favorite examples that sum up the kind of ditzy character Gracie portrayed to audiences. Like she was the one who grew grapefruits so large that it took only 8 of them to make a dozen. Or how she figured horses must be deaf because you never see them at concerts. Or how she cheated on her driver's test by copying the car in front of her. And she had an uncle who drained all the water out of his swimming pool before diving in because he knew how to dive, but he didn't know how to swim. Gracie's lovably ditzy one-liners carried the George and Gracie act. But George wanted everyone to know that the stage Gracie and the real-life Gracie were 2 different people. His Gracie, he said time and time again, was very, very smart. George and Gracie were unstoppable together as a comedy duo, but George would have to be patient when it came to having Gracie as a romantic partner. It finally came to the point where he couldn't go on anymore. That love grew too strong. Those bruises hurt too much. It was too difficult to spend so much time together when he loved her so much but couldn't have her whole heart. So he told her they had to split up the act. She should go and marry her boyfriend and live a happy life, and George would find another partner. It was just too hard for him. He even wrote and sang her a little love song. And then Gracie surprised him. She chose to stay with him. She would rather say goodbye to Benny Ryan. There was no way she was walking away from George. They were meant to be together. George's little ultimatum came a week before Christmas, 1925. He shared how he felt, and the 2 parted ways. He thought that was it. He'd lost her. Until Gracie called him later that night at 3 a.m. and said she would be his. Little did she know, but George had bought a ring for $20 months before and carried it in his pocket everywhere he went, just waiting for the moment he could put it on Gracie's finger. Gracie told George she knew she loved him when she realized he's the only man who's ever made her cry. I decided that if you could make me cry, I must really love you, she told him. George and Gracie were married on January 7th, 1926, while touring in Cleveland, Ohio. The Newlyweds Act evolved the following year when they were picked up by the B.F. Keith Vaudeville circuit. And with this opportunity came bigger and better vaudeville theaters and better slots within the shows. With this move, they were finally making some money too. They were slowly making their way from those dingy vaudeville theaters to the big time, eventually making their way all the way to the very best stage a vaudevillian could land on, the Palace Theater in New York. If your vaudeville act landed on the Palace Theater stage, you knew you had made it. Al Jolson was there at the Palace Theater with them too, and a young man named Archie Leach. Most people know him as Cary Grant. With the B.F. Keith circuit, the Burns and Allen duo was soon making $750 per week. That would be $14,000 per week today. This was more money than George had ever seen, and he credits all of their success to Gracie. She was the heart of their act. The audience was laughing at her. They were showing up to see her. Before I found out I had no talent, I was too big a star to do something else, he said. After making it to the Palace Theater stage, George and Gracie had made it. They were now in high demand. They were famous. Through their vaudeville circles, George and Gracie eventually met comedy writer Al Boasberg, and he helped them dial in the perfect act. He took their natural chemistry and their individual personalities and curated it into really funny bits for them to use. Until they reached the point of being able to hire a writer, George himself had written every line of their routines. He still did much of the writing, but he had some help now. George hadn't had much success at all until the point he met Gracie. He had been struggling to survive. As he put it, when I was a singer, they laughed. When I was a comedian, they didn't. He just hadn't really found his niche yet, and he hadn't made a mark on the stage at all. But together with Gracie and the writing help of Al Boasberg, he was finally making that mark. He didn't really have a backup plan for his life, so this was great. Life was good for George Burns and Gracie Allen. They were in love, they were happy, their professional life was going nowhere but up, and they felt financially secure. But 1927, the year they signed on with B.F. Keith, was one of the most prominent years in entertainment history. It was the year the first talking film was released, The Jazz Singer. Many in the business didn't see the significance of this moment. They thought silent films would reign and talking films would be a passing fad. Of course, they were very wrong. This marked the beginning of the end of the silent film era, and it marked the beginning of the end for vaudeville. Ironically, the man who delivered the first dialogue in a feature film on a movie screen was one of the biggest vaudeville stars in the country, Al Jolson. None of this drastic change occurred overnight, of course. The changes in the entertainment landscape was a gradual transition. On the film side of things, studios had to upgrade their sound stages and their equipment to be able to accommodate sound. Theaters had to be wired for sound. Actors had to be sound tested. Many silent film actors were immigrants and spoke with heavy accents. New stars had to be found. Audiences had to be convinced that talking pictures were the wave of the future. George and Gracie were given the opportunity to be on the silver screen when they starred in about 20 comedy shorts for Paramount in 1929 and 1930. 2 years later, they appeared in their first feature film, The Big Broadcast with Bing Crosby. Another form of entertainment that threatened the decades-old popularity of vaudeville was radio. This, according to George, was more of a threat than talking pictures. It was a bigger threat than any of the other things that threatened vaudeville. Because with radio, audiences could enjoy a variety of engaging entertainment without leaving their homes or paying admission at a theater. They could hear all their favorite stars and all their favorite songs. Like George put it, once it took a new song 6 years to become known nationally. Radio made it happen in 2 weeks. Of course, not every family could afford a radio set, but for those who could, they could be consuming the exact same entertainment at the same time throughout the country for the very first time. So, what did this all mean for vaudeville? Well, there were plenty of people who still enjoyed watching this electric variety of live entertainment on the stage. Vaudeville wasn't hitting the scrapyard quite yet. But the introduction of the talkie and radio definitely signaled the start of its journey down the hill. For now, the dynamic duo of Burns and Allen was flying high on the stage. George and Gracie were doing so well and received so positively by audiences that they were able to travel to Europe for a string of shows in 1930, something they continued for years to come. This was huge for the poor little boy from the Lower East Side that sang for pennies on the street corner and didn't know if he would have food to eat each day. He never would have imagined he would be given these great opportunities in his life. He'd worked hard for it, though. George and Gracie held on tight to their vaudeville careers as long as possible. But if there was one thing George Burns was good at, how do we pick just one? But it was adapting to different forms of entertainment and media as entertainment evolved. Once he saw that vaudeville was indeed entering the sunset of its long and lucrative existence, he knew it was time for he and Gracie to make the transition to radio. The duo made their radio debut in 1932, appearing on the Robert Burns Panatella Show on CBS. With this presence, their audience rose exponentially. What made George and Gracie able to make a smooth transition to radio over other styles of vaudeville comics and performers was that their act wasn't highly physical. It was mostly verbal, perfect for a non-visual medium. Now grounded in this new medium, by the end of the year following their radio debut, George and Gracie would have their own radio show. Their show underwent a series of names. It was commonplace for radio shows to be named after their main sponsor. Some of the names they worked under were the White Owl Program, the Campbell's Tomato Juice Program, the Grape Nuts Program, I love grape nuts, the Chesterfield Program, the Heinz Honey and Almond Cream Program, the Hormel Program, the Swan Soap Show, Maxwell House Coffee Time, and the Amident Toothpaste Show. As for their paychecks, if they were happy with that $750 per week on the vaudeville circuit, they must have been ecstatic when they reached a few $1,000s per week on radio, each. George and Gracie shared their hilarious brand of comedy via the radio waves for a highly successful 18 years, from 1932 to 1950. Outside of radio, they also appeared in over 20 films during the 1930s. One of the most prominent motion pictures George and Gracie appeared in was 1937's Damsel in Distress with Fred Astaire and Joan Fontaine. Shifting back to their private lives now. 8 years into their marriage, George and Gracie were ready to expand their family. By 1934, they were settled into their new venture with radio, which meant a more stable life not lived out of a trunk traveling to new towns each day. They finally felt like they had a safe and consistent environment to bring children into. They were unable to have children themselves, so they adopted a little girl, Sandra, in 1934. She was just 5 weeks old when they brought her home, and they loved and spoiled her immediately. Maybe there were some babies who had more toys than Sandy did, George said. Santa Claus's kids, for instance. 2 years later, in 1936, they adopted a little boy and named him Ronald. Ronald had been premature, and he experienced some health problems as his little body tried to develop. And this is why Gracie chose him. She knew he needed them. George loved his kids, but he had this to say about little Ronnie when they brought him home. Quote, "I have to admit that Ronnie was an ugly baby. People say all babies look like Winston Churchill. Ronnie made Winston Churchill look handsome. Ronnie looked like a wrinkled little man with a funny-shaped head." End quote. All joking aside, George was crazy about his kids. And I've seen several photos of Ronnie, and he was an adorable little boy. They were both super cute kids. About a year after they adopted Ronnie, they received a phone call from the adoption agency. They had a little girl that they wanted to go to George and Gracie, but they were content with their 2 children. They had dinner guests over, though, when that call came in. Harpo and Susan Marks. They already had 3 adopted children, but they wanted more. So they went to the adoption agency and adopted that little girl. Harpo Marks said he wanted as many children as their home had windows, so that when they went away, they could look back and see a cute little face in every single window. They ended up settling at 4. As far as George and Gracie's marriage, it was good. They loved each other deeply. They were truly devoted partners in life. George worshipped the ground Gracie walked on. But George was unfaithful. Once, just once. Something he admitted to and was very open about. He messed up. He knew he messed up. He deeply regretted this mistake, and it sounds like Gracie was a very forgiving partner. Despite this huge bump, George and Gracie were very much in love. They completed each other. They were a team, with or without an audience. George knew when he cheated on Gracie that it was something he would never, ever do again. There was no way he was going to risk losing her. As George and Gracie's radio career evolved and the world of entertainment evolved as it entered the 1940s, they decided it was time to make a few changes to their finely oiled comedy machine. Until that point, their stage personas of George and Gracie were not acting as a romantic couple, more so a sometimes flirtatious duo of two single people. But by the middle of the decade of the 1940s, George had turned 50 years old and Gracie wasn't too far behind him, so they decided it was time to adjust their act to reflect that of a married couple. The whole world knew that they were an actual married couple, but they had never reflected that into their act. Why fix it if it's not broken, right? But there was a bit of a culture change during this time as well. Radio programs were filled with wholesome family values, and by shifting their stories in that direction, it would help their ratings. Which it did. It was the right move. Ever ready to evolve with the entertainment world, George was keeping his eye on the newest and hottest form of entertainment out there: television. In 1950, George and Gracie were offered by CBS to star in their very own television program, The George Burns and Gracie Allen Show. They basically took their popular radio program and adapted it to the screen, and they were hugely popular right off the bat. They filmed at CBS Studios in New York City at first, and then the show's production moved to Hollywood for the remainder of its run. The couple's children, Sandra and Ronald, appear on the show as well, essentially playing themselves as their parents' children. Although all four of them had separate TV personas than they had off-screen. At the start of the show in 1950, Sandra was 16 and Ronald was 14, so they grew into adulthood with the show. The Burns and Allen Show ran a highly successful run from 1950 to 1958. Turning out a total of 291 episodes. At the time of its finale, it was the longest-running sitcom in history. Television history was short, but they had the longest-running sitcom. George and Gracie's small-screen delivery and television success was often compared to Desi and Lucy. From the fact that as a woman in the 1950s, Gracie Allen had a lot of creative control over their show, to the fact that the strong patriarchy embraced in 1950s culture was comedically challenged regularly on their show. They had huge names on as guest stars, very much like Lucy and Desi had. In fact, Lucille Ball was one of George and Gracie's guest stars, as were Clark Gable, Hedy Lamarr, Cary Grant, Ronald Reagan, Shirley Temple, Charles Boyer, Marlena Dietrich, Lana Turner, Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, Eddie Cantor, Al Jolson, Frank Sinatra, and of course, George's very best friend, Jack Benny. Heard of any of them? When the family moved to the West Coast, they had a home built on North Maple Drive in Beverly Hills, a home that both George and Gracie went on to live in for the rest of their lives. I, of course, love it when I get my hands on a description of an old movie star home. And George Burns was gracious enough to share a little description and photos of their home in his book, Gracie, A Love Story. He wrote, quote, "From the front, it looked like a movie set. It was white wood and brick, with more windows than Harpo Marx had children, and an elaborate canopied grillwork balcony running almost the entire length. Gracie had planted olive trees in the front yard, and in anticipation of our first harvest, I started drinking martinis. The newspapers described the house as a palace and claimed we had a swimming pool, private golf course, and tennis courts. We did have a swimming pool. The golf course must have been really private because I didn't know anything about it. And the closest thing we had to a tennis court was a warped ping pong table." End quote. George said they had a pool and game house on the property, which included 4 backgammon tables because Gracie loved backgammon. Gracie had the home decorated very beautifully. It was soft and comfortable and beautiful, just like she was, George wrote. By the end of the run of the George Burns and Gracie Allen show, Gracie had begun to have some alarming health issues. She had a mild heart attack in the early to mid-50s. I read conflicting reports, and even George didn't seem to remember exactly when. But her heart was weakened after that, making it often difficult for her to perform. George wanted to keep going with the TV show, so she obliged. But on February 17, 1958, Gracie publicly announced her retirement, not only from the television show, but from show business altogether. She'd been working since she was 14 years old. She was ready to relax. Her body needed her to relax. George admitted to being in a bit of denial at first when Gracie began having health problems, even after her heart attack. He wrote, quote, "When I think of Gracie, when I think about our life together, the thing that always surprises me is that her heart went bad. When I think of Gracie, I remember a little girl with more energy than anyone else around her. A strong, vibrant, sometimes tough woman. When I think about someone with a bad heart, that wasn't Gracie at all." End quote. Gracie's heart was not well. She suffered from frequent angina attacks by the time she retired. 4 years after the ending of the couple's successful television show, Gracie Allen suffered another heart attack. This was a big one. She survived it, but her already weakened heart suffered greatly from it. At this point, George hired around-the-clock nurses to care for her. She was still able to be pretty active, but she had to be very careful. 3 years later, she suffered a third heart attack. This one was too much for her heart to handle. Gracie Allen, the absolute love of George Burns' life, the person who completed him in every single way, died on August 27, 1964. The loss of Gracie was understandably devastating for George Burns. He was overcome with intense grief. He didn't know how he was going to survive without her. He said he cried until there were no more tears left. He cried every last drop of tears his body could produce. For weeks, months. The couple had separate beds in Gracie's last months, and the only thing that provided even a little comfort to George in the depths of his grief was to sleep in her bed. It was really, really hard. Losing someone you love so much is really hard, and these two were rarely ever apart in their entire life together. He said Gracie was his next breath. Losing Gracie was the hardest thing George Burns would ever go through. If you want to experience a true love story, read Gracie, A Love Story. If you want to laugh, read it. If you want to cry, read it. If you want to bawl your eyes out, read the last page. I'm not sure any man has ever loved a woman as much as George Burns loved Gracie Allen. George Burns was born to perform. He wanted to keep performing. He was 68 years old. He had many years left to perform, he thought. But what was he going to do without the better half of his comedy partnership? What was next for him without Gracie by his side? Well, he wasn't quite sure, but he was going to figure it out. First, he tried to go on with the television show, but it wasn't successful without the Gracie component of the George and Gracie super team. Next, he joined the cast of a TV show called Wendy and Me, starring Ron Howard and Connie Stevens. That show only lasted for 1 year. Next, George hit the nightclub scene. He returned to the energy of a live audience, which had always been his favorite. He said there was absolutely nothing in the world like receiving a laugh from a good live audience. He did acts in smaller venues, as well as venues like Carnegie Hall and the New York Philharmonic Hall. George Burns pretty much exclusively did the nightclub act for almost a decade, and then it was time to jump back into movies in the 1970s. George's very best friend, comedian Jack Benny, had been cast in Neil Simon's The Sunshine Boys in 1974, alongside Walter Matthau. a story about a vaudevillian comedy duo who couldn't stand each other off stage, but were being reluctantly reunited for a television special. But Jack Benny had pancreatic cancer. His health declined rapidly, and he died before filming began. One of his dying wishes was that his best friend, George Burns, would take that part. They had wanted an actual aging vaudeville actor for the part, so he would be perfect. It's a pretty funny movie. It's a very grumpy old man, which Matthew also starred in a couple decades down the road. George Burns won an Academy Award for his work in The Sunshine Boys. The Sunshine Boys signaled a new chapter for 79-year-old George Burns: movies. And it would remain his all-time favorite movie that he worked on throughout the rest of his life. George addressed the loss of his very best friend, Jack Benny, in his book, All My Best Friends. In fact, as I was reading this book while taking my journey through the life of George Burns, I kept thinking that the book should have been titled The Jack Benny Tribute Book. Or maybe more in line with his book about Gracie, Jack Benny, A Love Story. George clearly loved and admired Jack so much. He wrote about a lot of legends in that book: Harpo Marx, Al Jolson, Fanny Bryce, Bob Hope, Milton Berle, Ed Wynn, Frank Fay, Eddie Cantor, Gracie, of course. But no other name was mentioned in that book more than Jack Benny, his number one best friend. Here's what George said about the day Jack died. Quote, "I was just devastated. If I hadn't just had a heart operation, I would have needed one. I was at the house when Jack Benny died. It was just before noon on December 26th when Mary came downstairs and said, 'Jack's dead.' Just like that, Jack's dead. 'I'm going up,' I told her. 'No, you can't,' she said. 'The doctor said.' 'I knew him longer than the doctor did. I'm going up.' Jack was lying there with his hands clasped together on his chest, just barely touching his chin. From the man who had turned silence into a punchline, the silence was just awful. We had a great friendship. Knowing how enthusiastic Jack was about things, he probably would have said it was the greatest friendship that two men had ever had, then told everyone they had to go and have one. I'll tell you this, though. I knew him 55 years, and I never once walked out on him when he was playing the fiddle, and he never laughed when I sang. I think that's pretty good." End quote. He talked about how hard and how long he cried, just as he had when he lost Gracie. "I cried," he said. "I cried more for me than him. I wasn't really crying for Jack. That wouldn't have done any good. Besides, how bad could death really be? I mean, you never really hear anybody complaining about it." Oh, George, working through that pain with comedy. Maybe George's best-known movie role came in 1977, playing God in Oh God with John Denver. The funniest part of the premise being that God looked and talked like George Burns. And it was a huge success and resulted in a sequel in 1980 and a third in 1984. George Burns was 88 years old in 1984, and as busy as ever. These weren't the only movies he was appearing in. George Burns was all over the place. He co-starred opposite 80 superstars like Brooke Shields and Christian Slater. His final film appearance was in 1994, a movie called Radioland Murders, when he was 98 years old. George Burns refused to retire. In his later years, he wrote, "I should point out that since George Burns left school at the age of 7, he had never really learned how to read or write as a child. It wasn't until he was an adult that he hired a tutor to teach him how to read and how to write. And he discovered during the process that he had dyslexia. All of that, and there he was in his 80s as a published author. Between 1976 and 1996, the once illiterate George Burns with a third-grade education had authored 9 books, mostly memoirs and life advice books. I am now the proud owner of 2 of those books. And I must say, taking a journey through George Burns' books is an honor and a delight. What a storyteller. And with every word I read, all 639 pages of them between the two. It was like having George Burns himself present in my home. Sitting in the chair in my living room, martini on the side table, cigar frequently filling his lips as he told these stories with that warm and comforting little smile of his. Fun fact about the cigar, you knew George Burns was telling a joke opposed to reality if he took a puff of his cigar after he spoke. Like I said at the top, I remember seeing George Burns frequently on TV throughout my 1980s childhood. I wasn't quite sure what he was famous for, but I knew he was famous, and I knew he was funny. He always had those round, dark-rimmed glasses on, and he always had a cigar in his hand. He was a funny, cute old man, and he seemed to be all over the place on TV talk shows and variety shows. In my memory, at least. He even said himself, quote, "I don't believe in dying. It's been done. I'm working on a new exit. Besides, I can't die now. I'm booked." End quote. George Burns seemed like an immortal spirit that had always been there and would always be there, much like his character of God. But even George Burns wasn't immortal. George had a pretty serious fall in the shower in July of 1994 when he was 98 years old, requiring surgery to remove fluid in his skull. Not long after, he developed influenza, a very serious condition for an elderly person. Both of these things were. George turned 100 years old on January 20th, 1996. Just 7 weeks later, on March 9th, 1996, that bright, immortal-seeming spirit quietly slipped away. It slipped away from us, but returned to where he'd always belonged, to his beloved Gracie. George was laid to rest next to Gracie, and their headstone reads, "Together again." Now, I would like to share a few more interesting things I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. Like I said, George Burns' very best friend for decades was Jack Benny. When Jack Benny died at the end of 1974, George Burns was asked to deliver his eulogy. He was so overcome with emotion that he simply couldn't do it. He talked about it in his book, All My Best Friends, and then, of course, added a little joke about it. I guess you could say that was the last time I hung up on him. George was the man of the hour on the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast in 1978, and when Dean announced that they would be showing a highlight of George and Jack together on This Is Your Life from the mid-50s, you could visibly see George take a deep, deep breath in preparation for what he was about to see. He was still hurting so deeply at the loss of his very best friend just a few years earlier. Bullet point number 2. I, of course, watched the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast of George Burns with the free time I do not have. I actually stayed up way past my bedtime to watch it, but I just had to. A few of his roasters were Milton Berle, Orson Welles, Ronald Reagan, and, of course, Phyllis Diller. Try getting that girl to miss a roast. There were a lot of jokes about him running around with much, much younger women. He was 82 years old at the time of the roast. I couldn't find any information about his later love life, but it seems like he was doing pretty good in his golden years. Bullet point number 3. George Burns claims to have loitered around Ellis Island scamming incoming immigrants to the United States. He would sell them dancing lessons, telling them that it was a requirement for becoming a U.S. citizen. George Burns also said 100 times that he was a big, huge liar, so who knows if that's true, but it does seem like something he would do. I just want to throw in some random George Burns zingers before I proceed to our conclusion. Some of them I got from his books, and some from a wonderful appearance I watched of him from 1989. A Conversation with George Burns, broadcast from Disney World. First, this one's from one of his books. When I started, the only types of entertainment we had were vaudeville, the burlesque, minstrel shows, the theater, silent movies, and the hole in the wall between our bathroom and the Wisnowski's bedroom. When asked in 1989 about his love of cigars and martinis, 93-year-old George Burns said, "You see, at my age, if I don't hold on to something, I might fall down. I don't inhale. I never smoked a cigarette. It doesn't hurt me, but it hurts everyone in the room. And I drink between 4 and 5 martinis a day. The doctor that told me to stop is dead." When asked who his favorite president was, Lincoln. I voted for him twice. About the changing times in society. It's hard for me to get used to these changing times. I remember when the air was clean and the sex was dirty. Here is George's advice for having a happy career. Fall in love with what you're going to do for a living. It is terribly important. Terribly important to be 93 years old and wake up in the morning and get out of bed and love what I'm going to do that day. I can't make any money in bed, but my sister Goldie made a fortune. And I don't think anyone should retire. What do you do when you retire? You sit there and you play with your cuticles. Did you ever play with your cuticles? I tried it and it's not exciting. I'll tell you something. I would rather be a failure in something I love to do than be successful at something that I hate. Now that is some solid advice. I feel incredibly fortunate myself to have found that thing in my own career, and I hope you all have too. Another quip about retirement, George said, "Retirement at 65 is ridiculous. When I was 65, I still had pimples." On aging, first you forget names, then you forget faces. Next, you forget to pull your zipper up, and finally, you forget to pull it down. And the best advice for living a long and happy life. Think positive and stay active. In conclusion, how can one sum up someone like George Burns? The multitude of his career, of his life, was grand and vast. He had done it all. He had seen it all. He had experienced it all. His chances were slim as a child. He was the child of poor immigrant parents. He had to compete against 11 siblings for food every day. He lost his father devastatingly young. He had a learning disability. He dropped out of school at 7 years old. One would assume his life in extreme poverty would have extended into his own adult life of extreme poverty. Menial job after menial job, just trying to get by. But George Burns had drive and he had ambition. He loved an audience. He didn't care if it was an audience of 1 or 10,000. He didn't care if it was a dog or a human. He loved to perform, and he knew he was going to make performing his life. But it wasn't easy. Not, that is, until he found the missing piece of his puzzle. Gracie Allen. Together, George and Gracie created a comedy empire. They were a team. They were the best team. The story of George and Gracie is a love story. No, their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was pretty dang close. It was real. Their love was real. It was the realest thing George Burns ever had in his life. I mean, he wrote a book devoted to his love for her, 24 years after losing her. An entire 319-page book. Gracie, A Love Story, is a true testament to that love. I know my husband loves me more than anything, but I guarantee you he will not be writing a book about our love after I die. Imagine having a love that powerful. I really hope there is an afterlife, solely for the reason that George Burns and Gracie Allen were able to be reunited. George Burns could have easily retired after Gracie passed away, but retirement was as bad as any 4-letter word in George's mind. Retirement was out of the question. As long as people hired or booked him, he wasn't going anywhere until his body and mind made that decision for him. His career spanned collecting pennies in a hat in saloons as a child, to rickety little vaudeville stages, to bigger and more glamorous vaudeville theaters, to European stages, to radio, to television, to nightclub acts, to movies, and to everything in between. If George Burns was present, those within hearing distance were being entertained. The man simply could not entertain people. His quips were so sharp and so quick. I think it would have been so intriguing to step inside that man's brain for a day. And yet, he always gave 100% of the credit to Gracie. But George was funny. They simply do not make them like George Burns anymore. The world will never, ever be able to experience a presence like that ever again. I feel blessed to have been able to live within some of his time on Earth and his sparkle on my family's television screen. The world lost an absolute gem when it lost George Burns. Gem doesn't even seem to be a good enough way to describe him. Nothing can truly describe the spirit of George Burns. Thank you, George Burns, for showing us, once again, how to turn our dreams into reality. That a strong drive and a lot of really painstakingly hard work can really truly pay off. If anyone can show us that, it is you. Thank you for showing us love and for sharing that love with us all. Thank you for just being George Burns. I'm off to make a martini now in your memory. And thank you all for listening. Before I go, let's talk about Christmas for a minute. Have you started your shopping yet? Let me tell you what I strive to do when I'm shopping for my loved ones. I love to support small businesses and creative makers. I like to shop at our local shops and pick up some stuff from local art and craft shows. I like to help the people out there that are putting so much of their time and energy into their passion projects. Beyond local, you know what else would make a wonderful Christmas gift? Gifting a Patreon subscription to a cool little indie podcast to someone you love. Have someone on your shopping list who loves old Hollywood, or maybe just loves pop culture and you think they might love learning about old Hollywood. Maybe they would like the gift of Stars of the Golden Age bonus content. Just an idea, please consider it. It's okay to buy things for yourself too, wink wink. Just pop on over to patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast, and there's an easy link to gift a membership. This month's cocktail party episode on Patreon is really fun. You don't want to miss it. And the regular bonus episode is all about life on the studio lot during the Golden Age, the age of the old studio system. I talk about the commissary, the dressing rooms, the sets, the classes, all kinds of good stuff. Fun times, come join us. Thanks again for joining me on a journey through another legendary life. Look for the positive in every day, be kind to everyone you encounter, love someone at least half as much as George Burns loved Gracie Allen, and have a great rest of your week. For this episode, I used the books All My Best Friends by George Burns and Gracie, A Love Story by George Burns. I watched A Conversation with George Burns, which originally aired in 1989, and this is available on YouTube. The Dean Martin Celebrity Roast of George Burns from 1978. An article from the University of Arizona titled George Burns and Gracie Allen, Vaudeville's Greatest Comic Duo by David Soren. And IMDB.